Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Last week, the CRTC completed their regulatory process under the Online Streaming Act and decided that foreign streaming services who make more than, I think it's 25 million in Canadian revenues, and that's the important part, Canadian revenues in a year, will need to contribute 15% of those revenue, revenue toward things like the Canadian Media Fund, which help to fund Canadian media productions and so on. And immediately, this is being panned. Americans are calling this discriminatory, which is laughable. Pierre Poilievre has resurrected this old talking point about a Netflix tax, even though this is not a tax. And I figured we should unpack a little bit about that and just look at how this affects the Canadian media landscape. Now, the notion that this is discriminatory is it's ridiculous, but it's also indicative of kind of where things are at. Canadian services, either broadcasters or streaming services, need to pay into these funds as part of their broadcast mandates. And for them, it was discriminatory that they would have to pay into it when American-based web giant services didn't. And so what this really does is levels that playing field and creates a more even fairness for competition purposes. Again, the Americans claiming that this is somehow discriminating against them is wrong. What it's doing is leveling the playing field and making sure that Canadian broadcasters are on the same field as they are in terms of what they need to contribute to these funds. The other thing to remember is that those streaming services can access these funds when they pay into them, so they can use those funds to create shows that they can put on their platforms. Now, for a while, they went on this whole thing about, we don't know what counts as Canadian content, even though the CRTC has had a point system on their website since 1984. Well, it wasn't on the website in 1984, but they've had this point system for what counts as CanCon since 1984. So there really were no surprises there. Yes, there have been consultations about how to refine this point system, and they're coming out with a new format, but the broad strokes are largely the same in terms of how many points you get for Canadian creatives, in terms of writers, producers, directors, and so on these series. And for the longest time, Canadian broadcasters had needed like an 8 out of 10 or something like that for a show to count as CanCon for their obligations. And that's why you had a whole bunch of shows at one point that had shot in Canada, mostly Canadian cast, but had one or two big American stars in order to kind of have that draw, but that would still count as CanCon. So we had a whole bunch of shows like that at one point. Nevertheless, this is what we are essentially expecting these foreign services who want to dominate the Canadian landscape to essentially contribute back to. So yes, you have to pay some revenues in, but you can also take them out to create, as part of the process, to create these shows that you can put on your platform and then generate more revenue from. And if they think that the current Canadian offerings are terrible, well, guess what? You have an opportunity to create some new Canadian content that you think that will sell not only in Canada, but internationally. And, there's some good examples of that. For example, Schitt's Creek or Workin' Moms. A few other shows like that, which were CBC hits because CBC took the chance on them, and the productions gave them airtime, and later when they hit services like Netflix, they exploded internationally. So essentially this is just giving these platforms the same opportunity to do that, using in part the funds that they have contributed to this service. And I think that's also a really important thing because Canada, yes, we have a large film and television service base. here, but we are, for the most part, essentially a resource colony for the American media industry. And we need to be able to do more than that. Even though, we have shows that blur the lines, is it Canadian, is it American? They never say what city they're in. Even though when they show, paper money, that it tends to be in Canadian currency. But they just kind of like elide over a lot of that and don't really say what it, where these things are. For the sake of international sales, or because they're in a co-pro with an American broadcaster or network. So, they sand off some of the Canadian edges, but still counts as CanCon for those purposes. These networks or these streaming services can do something similar and still get their CanCon credits if they structure everything correctly. But the broader point I want to make is that amidst all of this, we are not telling enough Canadian stories. And there's a really damning stat, which is to the effect of there is something like 7 standing sets in studios around this country that are the White House for different productions that are being shot, and so on. There are 0 standing sets about anything Canadian political. There's no House of Commons set anywhere. There's no anything Parliament Hills. And on the rare occasion when we would get a production that would focus on Canadian politics, yes, they would occasionally do a little bit of shooting on Parliament Hill. There was a Paul Gross miniseries where they shot in a couple of committee rooms in Centre Block. This was years ago. There was that Terry Fallis Best Laid Plans. They did a few shots in the building, but anytime you had something that was supposed to be like an actual room inside of it, not shot in Ottawa or on Parliament Hill. There was recently a Murdoch Mysteries episode, which claimed to be the cabinet room. Which looked nothing like what the actual old cabinet room in East Block looks like. Nothing at all. And there was a whole weird thing with the mace, which would have nothing to do with cabinet, and so on. And so it's kind of damning that we don't have any of this political stuff of our own. No political intrigues, no political dramas. No shows in which we have any political federal political dynamic in them at all, and yet we are producing and filming and creating all these shows, American shows, which would have the White House in it, using being filmed on Canadian soil. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think this is something that hopefully the ability to have more of these media funds might maybe one day address. Fingers crossed in any case. But I think these are conversations we need to be having. And the fact that we are requiring people who are in the Canadian market to contribute to the Canadian media ecosystem, I think is important. And I think this is also why when we get Polyev going on about the so-called Netflix tax and how much this is costing Canadians and how terrible it is, absolutely none of what he's saying is about the actual merits of the program in terms of funding Canadian productions so that Canadians can see ourselves on the screen. None of that is being discussed. And I think that's unfortunate because I think that's an important part of this conversation. We film a lot of things here for our American media partners, and almost none of it is actually about Canada. And so I think I'm hoping maybe if this does go ahead and that the CRTC doesn't get overruled because it's considered a trade irritant or some nonsense like that, that we can maybe hopefully see some of these funds going towards something that gives us some of this political drama that maybe we deserve in Canada, or maybe we need to dispel this notion that Canadian politics is so boring that nobody wants to hear about it. I personally don't think that's true, and I think we've got plenty of instances where we could mine our politics to put drama on the screen, but yeah. So anyway, anytime you hear this Netflix tax, it's nonsense. Anytime you hear that American web giants are complaining that this is discriminatory, well, they were getting a sweetheart deal, and this is just leveling the playing field. And so these are things we need to consider as this debate starts swirling around. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.